In the winter of 1942, on the frozen banks of the Volga River, two empires bled themselves nearly to death. What began as a campaign of conquest became a struggle for survival. What was planned as a swift victory turned into a slaughter without equal. Here, in the shattered city of Stalingrad, the fate of the Second World War would change forever. By the summer of 1942, the war in the East had already devoured millions. When Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, he did not intend merely to defeat the Soviet Union. He intended to erase it. The invasion was conceived not as a conventional war, but as a racial and ideological crusade, a war of annihilation. Entire Soviet cities were encircled and starved. Prisoners of war died by the hundreds of thousands. Villages vanished from the map. Yet despite catastrophic losses, the Soviet state did not collapse. Moscow had held, Leningrad still endured, and the Red Army, though battered, continued to fight. By early 1942, Germany faced a strategic dilemma. The lightning victory promised by Blitzkrieg had failed. Resources were dwindling, and the war, meant to be short, was becoming a test of endurance. Germany was not prepared to fight. Hitler needed a decisive blow. He found it in the south. In April 1942, Hitler approved Fall Blau, Case Blue. The objective was oil. Germany's war machine ran on fuel it did not possess. The Caucasus oil fields, Maykop, Grozny, Baku, were the lifeblood Hitler believed would sustain the Reich and strangle the Soviet Union in a single stroke. But guarding the northern flank of this advance was a city on the Volga. Stalingrad. At first, it was not the primary objective, but the city carried a name, Joseph Stalin himself. Capturing it would be a propaganda triumph, a symbolic humiliation of the Soviet regime. What began as a strategic necessity soon became an obsession. Hitler diverted forces, plans were altered mid-campaign, speed was sacrificed for symbolism. The German Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, was ordered east toward the Volga. They believed the city would fall in weeks. Stalingrad was not merely a name. It was a city of nearly 500,000 people, factories, apartment blocks, tram lines, schools. The Volga River carried grain, oil, and steel from the Soviet heartland. As German forces advanced, evacuation began, but it was incomplete. Workers stayed at their machines, civilians dug trenches between apartment blocks, children filled sandbags. Stalin issued a blunt order: the city must be defended. There would be no surrender. Across the river, Soviet commanders prepared for the worst. Among them was Vasily Chuikov, a blunt, ruthless officer chosen for one reason: he understood that survival in Stalingrad would require fighting at point-blank range. The Luftwaffe unleashed one of the most devastating aerial bombardments in history. High explosives shattered buildings, incendiaries ignited firestorms, the Volga itself burned as oil tanks exploded along the riverbanks. Tens of thousands of civilians died in a single day. Yet the destruction created something the Germans did not anticipate: a battlefield of ruins. Collapsed buildings became fortresses, cellars became bunkers, rubble erased lines of sight, negating German armor and air power. Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a maze. In September 1942, German infantry entered the city. What followed defied every doctrine of modern warfare. Battles were fought for individual rooms, for staircases, for shell craters no wider than a man's body. The Soviets called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. Snipers ruled the ruins. One Soviet marksman, Vasily Zaitsev, became a symbol of resistance, hunting German officers through shattered streets. Orders were simple: not one step back. The Volga lay behind them. Retreat meant death, either by German bullets or Soviet firing squads. German casualties mounted, progress slowed to meters per day. Still, Paulus pressed forward. The city had to fall. Every night, under artillery fire and air attack, Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga in small boats. Many never made it. Wounded soldiers bled out on the riverbanks, boats capsized under fire, ice formed on uniforms as winter approached. Yet they kept coming. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was no longer about territory. It was about time. Every hour the Germans fought in the ruins was an hour the Red Army prepared something far larger, something the Sixth Army could not see. The battle for the city had begun, but the battle for the war was still to come. By September 1942, Stalingrad had ceased to exist as a city in any conventional sense. What remained was a broken skeleton of concrete, brick, and twisted steel, burning by day, freezing by night. For the German Sixth Army, this was supposed to be the final act. The Luftwaffe had smashed the city. The Volga lay within sight. Soviet resistance, they believed, was near collapse. They were wrong. What unfolded inside the ruins was a form of warfare that no army had prepared for and no soldier would ever forget. A battle measured not in kilometers, but in stairwells, not in divisions, but in rooms. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. The destruction of Stalingrad should have been a blessing for the attackers. Instead, it became their prison. Every collapsed building created cover. Every shell crater became a fighting position. Tanks could not maneuver. Artillery could not distinguish friend from foe. Air power was nearly useless when the enemy was only meters away. Soviet soldiers learned to cling to German lines so closely that artillery strikes risked killing their own men. They called it hugging the enemy. For the Germans, the rules of blitzkrieg no longer applied. Speed vanished, coordination vanished, certainty vanished. A German infantryman advancing into the city faced death from every direction at once. Windows, basements, attics, rubble piles that appeared lifeless until they erupted in gunfire. Snipers hunted officers first. Machine guns were hidden behind walls with holes smashed through at chest height. Grenades were rolled down staircases and tossed through shattered doorways. Men stopped sleeping. Fear became constant. At the center of the Soviet defense stood Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army. Chuikov understood something his German opponents did not. Stalingrad could not be defended like a normal city. It could only be defended by turning every structure into a fortress and every soldier into a weapon of delay. Chuikov abandoned traditional command posts. He established his headquarters barely a few hundred meters from German lines, buried beneath the ruins near the Volga. This was not bravado, it was necessity. If the Germans broke through, he wanted to die with his army. Orders were brutally simple. Hold at all costs, counterattack immediately, no matter the losses, never allow the Germans time to reorganize. Replacements arriving at the Volga were often given a rifle and ammunition for only a single engagement. Those without rifles were told to follow those who had them. The logic was merciless. If one man fell, another would take his weapon. Each night, the Volga River became a corridor of death. Under constant artillery fire, small boats ferried reinforcements into the city and carried the wounded back across the river. Many trips ended in disaster. Boats were shredded by shrapnel, men drowned in full equipment, others froze to death waiting on the banks. Yet the flow never stopped. The Germans could see the river, they could shell it, but they could not seal it. Every night, new Soviet units appeared in the ruins like ghosts. Inside the city, individual locations became legends of slaughter. The Red October Factory, the Barricade Gun Factory, the Tractor Factory. These were not just industrial sites, they were fortresses built of steel frames and reinforced concrete, ideal for defense. At the Tractor Factory, Tanks rolled directly off assembly lines and into combat, often crewed by workers who had built them only hours before. Entire battalions were annihilated fighting for a single building, only for it to change hands again by nightfall. The Germans began naming locations with grim humor. Commissar's house, the nail factory, the tennis racket. Each name marked a place where hundreds had died. One building in particular came to symbolize the madness of the battle. Pavlov's house. A four-story apartment block overlooking a key square, it was seized by a small Soviet detachment and transformed into a fortress. Mines were laid. Machine guns covered every approach. Snipers dominated the surrounding streets. For nearly 2 months, German forces assaulted the building repeatedly, suffering heavy casualties each time. Later, Soviet propaganda would claim that more Germans died trying to take that single building than in the entire campaign to capture Paris. Whether true or not, the legend captured the reality of Stalingrad. The smallest piece of ground could cost rivers of blood. Snipers became the most feared figures in the ruins. Among them was Vasily Zaitsev, a hunter from Siberia whose patience and marksmanship made him deadly in the urban wasteland. Zaitsev and others like him targeted officers, machine gun crews, artillery observers, anyone whose death would paralyze German units. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers avoided open ground, helmets were kept low, movement slowed to a crawl. A single unseen sniper could halt an advance for hours. Sniper duels became legendary, though many stories were later exaggerated or mythologized. What mattered was not the numbers, but the fear. Fear drained morale faster than bullets. By October, German casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. The Sixth Army was winning ground, but at a pace that made victory meaningless. Meters gained cost hundreds of lives. Buildings captured were destroyed beyond use. Units rotated in fresh were reduced to exhaustion within days. Winter was approaching. And yet Friedrich Paulus pressed on. Paulus was not a reckless commander. He understood the danger. He requested permission to pause, to regroup, to shorten his lines. But the decision was no longer his. In distant headquarters, Adolf Hitler had become personally invested in Stalingrad. The city bore Stalin's name. Its capture had become a matter of prestige. Withdrawal was unthinkable. As October turned to November, the German advance slowed almost to a halt. The Sixth Army controlled most of the city, but not the Volga. Soviet forces clung to narrow strips of riverbank, sometimes only a few hundred meters wide. From these footholds, they continued to resist. Chuikov's men lived underground, emerging only to fight. They scavenged weapons from the dead. They slept in shifts of minutes. The front lines were so close that opposing soldiers could hear each other breathing through walls. In some sectors, Germans and Soviets occupied opposite ends of the same building. War had been reduced to something primal. What the Germans did not know or refused to see was that Stalingrad was no longer the true focus of the battle. Beyond the city, across the open steppe, vast Soviet formations were gathering in silence. Fresh armies, tanks held in reserve, artillery positioned for something far larger than street fighting. The Red Army had learned from its defeats, and it was waiting. The Sixth Army, locked in the ruins, bleeding itself dry for every shattered wall, had become blind to the danger forming around it. Soon, Stalingrad would stop being a battle of attrition. It would become a trap. By mid-November 1942, the ruins of Stalingrad had consumed the attention of the German Sixth Army entirely. Inside the city, Paulus men were exhausted, under strength, and freezing. Ammunition was rationed, units were shattered and reassembled repeatedly. Officers were replaced almost as quickly as they fell. Yet for all their suffering, the Germans believed they were close. They could not see what was forming beyond the smoke and snow. While Stalingrad burned, the Red Army prepared its real blow far from the ruined city blocks, not in the streets, not in the factories, but on the open steppe to the north and south. The Soviet plan was called Operation Uranus, and it would not strike at the strongest part of the German line. It would strike at the weakest. The German advance toward the Caucasus had stretched the Wehrmacht to its limits. To hold the long flanks of the Sixth Army, Germany relied not on its own elite divisions, but on Allied forces, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units. Brave, often under-equipped, and critically short of anti-tank weapons. They were expected to hold against a Red Army that had already learned, adapted, and rebuilt. In Moscow, Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasylovsky finalized the plan. It was ambitious, it was risky, and it was designed not to push the Germans back, but to annihilate them. The goal was encirclement. Two massive Soviet pincers would strike simultaneously. One from the north, smashing through the Romanian Third Army, one from the south, collapsing the Romanian Fourth Army. If successful, they would meet west of Stalingrad, and the Sixth Army would be trapped. At dawn on November 19, 1942, the silence broke. More than 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire along the northern flank. The ground shook. The sky flashed white and orange. Entire Romanian positions vanished under the barrage. This was not the chaotic artillery of earlier Soviet offensives. This was precision, this was concentration, this was doctrine refined by failure. When the barrage lifted, Red Army infantry advanced through snow and smoke, followed by waves of tanks. Romanian defenses collapsed almost immediately. Anti-tank rifles were useless against T-34s. Artillery was overwhelmed. Communications disintegrated within hours. German reserves were too few, too far away, and already committed inside the city. The northern pincer surged forward. The following day, November 20, the southern blow fell. Once again, Soviet artillery crushed the Romanian Fourth Army. Once again, tanks broke through with terrifying speed. Entire divisions ceased to exist. By November 22, the two Soviet pincers met near the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers, Germans, Romanians, Croats, and auxiliaries were trapped inside what the Soviets called the Kessel. The cauldron. Inside Stalingrad, confusion turned to disbelief. Paulus received reports of breakthroughs, then reports of collapse, then reports of complete encirclement. The reality was undeniable. The Sixth Army was surrounded. Many German officers immediately urged a breakout. They argued that fuel and ammunition still existed, that a coordinated thrust westward might escape the noose before it tightened. Paulus requested permission. The response came from Adolf Hitler. The Sixth Army would hold its ground. No retreat. No surrender. Hitler believed the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air. It was a catastrophic illusion. The Sixth Army required at least 600 tons of supplies per day to survive. The Luftwaffe, under ideal conditions, could deliver less than a third of that. Winter conditions, Soviet fighters, and anti-aircraft fire made even that impossible. Aircraft were lost faster than they could be replaced. Pilots died landing on frozen, shell-pocked airstrips. Still, Hitler insisted. Stalingrad must be held as a fortress. Within days, the situation inside the pocket deteriorated rapidly. Fuel ran out first, tanks were abandoned, vehicles were cannibalized for parts, then left to freeze in the snow. Food followed. Rations were cut again and again, bread was mixed with sawdust, horses were slaughtered, eventually even that was gone. Frostbite crippled thousands. Wounded soldiers lay untreated in unheated cellars, delirious with fever. And still, the fighting inside the ruins continued. Soviet forces pressed inward, tightening the ring, crushing pockets of resistance one by one. The city that had consumed so many now consumed its conquerors. Paulus remained at his headquarters, issuing orders, maintaining discipline, clinging to procedure. He was a staff officer by nature, not a man of dramatic gestures. Yet even he understood what was coming. On January 30, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear. Paulus was expected to die. But before that final act, there would be weeks of agony. Weeks of hunger, weeks of cold, weeks of watching comrades fade away. The Soviet Union had achieved something no one believed possible in 1942. The German war machine, once unstoppable, had been caught, surrounded, and bled dry. Stalingrad was no longer about holding ground. It was about survival. And survival was slipping away. By December 1942, the Sixth Army no longer fought for victory. It fought to endure. The encirclement around Stalingrad tightened like a slow, deliberate fist. Soviet forces pressed inward from every direction, reducing the German-held territory day by day, kilometer by kilometer. Inside the pocket, nearly 250,000 men were trapped in a frozen wasteland of ruins, snow, and corpses. The Germans called it the Kessel, the cauldron. The failure of the airlift sealed the army's fate. The Luftwaffe, already weakened from years of war, could not sustain the impossible. Aircraft were lost to Soviet fighters, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, and the brutal winter weather. Many planes crashed attempting to land on frozen airstrips barely visible through snowstorms. Supplies that did arrive were tragically insufficient. A sack of flour here, a crate of ammunition there. Never enough, never close. The daily ration for a German soldier dropped to a few hundred calories. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing and relentless. Men spoke of food endlessly, recipes remembered from home, meals imagined in vivid detail. Some chewed leather belts, others boiled wallpaper paste, many simply lay down and waited. Cold was as deadly as hunger. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Winter uniforms were scarce. Fires were forbidden in daylight for fear of Soviet artillery spotting the smoke. Frostbite spread rapidly, fingers blackened, toes were amputated without anesthesia if they were amputated at all. The wounded suffered most. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, unheated, and undersupplied. Morphine ran out. Bandages were reused until they fell apart. Infections spread unchecked. Doctors made choices no one should ever have to make. Who might survive, who would not? Discipline slowly eroded. Not through mutiny or rebellion, but through exhaustion. Men stopped shaving, stopped writing letters, stopped believing. Some units disintegrated into loose bands of survivors, clinging to shattered buildings for shelter. Others maintained order to the bitter end, officers enforcing regulations that no longer made sense in a dying army. Still, there was no collapse. Despite everything, the Sixth Army continued to fight. Outside the pocket, Soviet commanders tightened their grip with calculated patience. Konstantin Rokossovsky oversaw the final phase of the operation. His goal was not speed, but certainty. Artillery was repositioned, supply lines were secured, reserves were held back. The Red Army had learned the cost of haste. They would not repeat it. In mid-December, a final glimmer of hope appeared for the encircled Germans. A relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, was launched by Erich von Manstein from the south. His armored formations drove hard toward Stalingrad, achieving early success and briefly closing to within 50 kilometers of the pocket. Inside Stalingrad, German soldiers listened for the sound of engines. They listened in vain. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout. Paulus obeyed. The relief force was halted, then driven back. Hope died quietly. By January 1943, the end was no longer in doubt. The Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final offensive to crush the pocket. Artillery barrages pounded German positions day and night. Resistance stiffened in some sectors, collapsed entirely in others. The pocket was split in two. Northern and southern groups were isolated, unable to support each other. Paulus' headquarters was overrun piece by piece, forced to relocate repeatedly as Soviet troops advanced through the ruins. Radio messages became shorter, then desperate, then silent. On January 30, 1943, Adolf Hitler made his final gesture. He promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal. The meaning was unmistakable. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus was expected to die. Instead, 2 days later, Soviet troops stormed his headquarters in the southern pocket. Paulus did not kill himself. He did not order a final charge. He surrendered. On February 2, 1943, the last organized German resistance in Stalingrad ceased. The battle was over. Of the more than 250,000 Axis soldiers encircled at Stalingrad, fewer than half went into captivity alive. Of those taken prisoner, only a fraction would ever return home. The Sixth Army, once one of the finest formations in the Wehrmacht, had been annihilated. For the first time in the war, an entire German field army had been destroyed. The myth of invincibility was gone. Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It was a graveyard, a warning, a turning point. The war in the East would continue for 2 more years. But after Stalingrad, the direction of that war was no longer in doubt. The guns fell silent on February 2, 1943. After more than 5 months of uninterrupted combat, the sounds that had defined Stalingrad, artillery, explosions, screaming engines, collapsing walls, simply stopped. What remained was a frozen wasteland of ruins and bodies, stretching from the Volga River to the western steppe. For the survivors of the Sixth Army, silence did not bring relief. It brought realization. They had lost. In the southern pocket of the city, Friedrich Paulus sat in a shattered basement beneath a department store. Around him were exhausted officers, maps that no longer mattered, radios that crackled with nothing but static. When Soviet troops arrived, there was no dramatic confrontation. No final speech, no heroic last stand. Paulus surrendered quietly. For the first time in German history, a field marshal had laid down his arms. In the northern pocket, resistance continued for another 2 days. Cut off, starving, and leaderless, German units fought on until ammunition ran out and commanders were killed or captured. On February 2, the last organized resistance ceased. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. What followed was one of the largest mass captures in military history. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, gaunt, frostbitten, barely alive, emerged from cellars and ruins with their hands raised. Many could no longer walk. Others collapsed moments after surrendering. They were herded together, searched, counted. Some wept openly, some stared ahead without expression, some simply lay down in the snow and never rose again. Of the roughly 90,000 Axis soldiers taken prisoner, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest died from disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion in Soviet captivity. Stalingrad claimed them long after the fighting ended. For the Soviet soldiers, Victory was absolute, but it was not triumphant. They moved through a city that no longer resembled anything human. Buildings stood like blackened skeletons. Streets were buried beneath rubble and frozen bodies. The Volga's banks were littered with wreckage, boats half buried in ice. The smell lingered everywhere. Victory had come at a staggering cost. At least 1.7 million casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, had been inflicted on both sides. Entire Soviet divisions had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Families across the USSR would never learn where their sons had fallen. But the meaning of Stalingrad went far beyond numbers. In Berlin, the reaction was shock. For the first time, the German public was confronted with undeniable defeat. The loss could not be hidden. An entire army had vanished. Joseph Goebbels declared total war, calling on the German population to sacrifice everything for survival. The tone had changed. Gone was the language of conquest. This was now a war of desperation. For Adolf Hitler, Stalingrad was a personal catastrophe. He raged against his generals. He blamed betrayal, cowardice, fate, anything but himself. Yet the truth was inescapable. His refusal to allow withdrawal had condemned the Sixth Army. His obsession with symbolism had overridden strategy. Stalingrad was not merely a defeat. It was a revelation. The German army could be encircled, it could be destroyed, it could be broken beyond recovery. Across the world, the impact was immediate. In London and Washington, Stalingrad was hailed as a turning point. Allied leaders saw proof that Nazi Germany could be beaten on land. In occupied Europe, resistance movements drew new hope. In the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became sacred ground. The city that bore Stalin's name had not fallen. It had devoured the enemy instead. Yet for those who had fought there, victory brought no celebration. The survivors carried Stalingrad with them for the rest of their lives. Nightmares, silence, memories of faces frozen in time. The battle had stripped war down to its rawest form, man against man, hunger against will, endurance against despair. Nothing afterward would ever feel the same. Stalingrad marked the moment the initiative on the Eastern Front passed irrevocably to the Red Army. From that point on, German forces would fight a long retreat through Kursk, through Ukraine, through Poland, until the war ended in the ruins of Berlin. But it was here, in this broken city on the Volga, that the direction of the war truly changed. The road to Berlin began at Stalingrad. When the battle ended, Stalingrad did not look like a victory. It looked like the end of the world. The city was reduced to ash, rubble, and twisted metal. Of its pre-war population, only a fraction remained. Civilians emerged from cellars and bunkers like survivors of some ancient cataclysm, moving through streets that no longer had names, guided only by memory and instinct. There was no celebration. There was only exhaustion. For the Red Army, Stalingrad was a triumph bought at a cost almost beyond comprehension. Entire formations had been destroyed to hold a few meters of ground. Commanders who survived carried the weight of decisions that had sent tens of thousands to their deaths. Yet the meaning of the victory was unmistakable. For the first time, Nazi Germany had lost an entire field army. Not repelled, not delayed, destroyed. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Across the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol of defiance and endurance. Newspapers and radio broadcasts spoke of sacrifice, heroism, and the unbreakable will of the Soviet people. The city's name was spoken with reverence. For soldiers at the front, Stalingrad proved something vital. The Germans could be beaten. Not just stalled, not just bled, beaten. Strategically, the consequences were enormous. The destruction of the Sixth Army shattered Germany's position in the south. The Caucasus campaign collapsed. Axis forces were forced into a long, fighting retreat that would never truly end. From Stalingrad onward, the Red Army held the initiative. In July 1943, that initiative would be confirmed at Kursk. In 1944, it would roll across Eastern Europe. In 1945, it would end in Berlin. Stalingrad was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end. In Germany, the defeat marked a turning point in public consciousness. The illusion of inevitable victory vanished. Black-edged letters arrived at homes across the Reich. Entire towns lost their sons in a single winter. Joseph Goebbels called for total war, urging Germans to sacrifice everything. Factories were reorganized. Women were mobilized. The state tightened its grip. But beneath the propaganda, doubt had taken root. If Stalingrad could fall, what else could be lost? For Adolf Hitler, Stalingrad hardened existing flaws. Rather than learning from the catastrophe, he retreated further into denial. He tightened control over the military, dismissed experienced commanders, and doubled down on the belief that willpower could overcome material reality. The lesson of Stalingrad, that modern industrial war punished rigidity and rewarded adaptability, was ignored. Germany would pay for that refusal again and again. For the prisoners of Stalingrad, the war did not end in February 1943. They marched east, through snow, mud, and hunger, into captivity that would last years. Disease and malnutrition claimed most before peace ever came. Of those who survived, many returned home broken in body and spirit. Stalingrad followed them long after release. So did the memories of those who never returned. The city itself was rebuilt. Brick by brick, street by street. Renamed Volgograd, it rose from the ruins as both a living city and a memorial. On Mamayev Kurgan, where the fighting had been among the fiercest, a colossal statue now stands, the motherland calls, watching over the Volga. It is not a monument to victory alone. It is a monument to loss. Stalingrad endures because it reveals the true nature of modern war. It was not won by brilliance alone, nor lost by cowardice. It was shaped by industry, logistics, ideology, and the relentless willingness of states to expend human lives on a scale never seen before. In the ruins of Stalingrad, heroism and horror existed side by side. A sniper protecting a crossing, a medic dragging the wounded through fire, a starving soldier standing his post because there was nowhere else to go. These moments did not change the world by themselves, but together they did. Stalingrad stands as a warning written in concrete and bone. A warning about pride, about obsession, about the cost of believing a war can be controlled once it has begun. It reminds us that victory in war is never clean, and that survival often comes at a price that echoes long after the guns fall silent. The Volga still flows past the city. It flows past rebuilt streets, past memorials, past the ground where hundreds of thousands fell. And it carries with it the memory of a battle that broke an army, turned a war, and reshaped the modern world. This was Stalingrad. Not just a battle, a reckoning.